We're looking at Lincoln Cathedral, city of Lincoln, Lincolnshire, England. That was a welcome sight for many weary Bomber Command crews returning from operations over Europe. I'm at the International Bomber Command Centre. This is a centre that's been made to keep alive the memories and the sacrifices of all those who served in the British Bomber Command. And here we can see they've created 271 panels with over 58,000 names of those who died serving. Men and women are on these panels. The youngest is 14 and the oldest, I believe, is 60. But of those names, during the Second World War, 55,573 young men lost their lives from a total force of 125,000 aircrew. That was a very high percentage death rate. Plus then there were those who were wounded, over 8,000, and nearly 10,000 that became prisoners of war but would also have been wounded. So all in all, there was around a 60% plus casualty rate. 12 operations were seen to be 30 missions, although quite a number of men carried on past that, 60 missions, some even going up to 100 missions. But of 100 airmen, something like only 27 would have survived the war without some sort of being killed, been wounded, been a prisoner of war, etc. But of course those who returned would also return with traumatic memories that they would keep with them for the rest of their lives. Airmen came from all over the world to serve with Bomber Command. The majority were from the UK, but we had men from the Commonwealth such as Australia, Canada, New Zealand, South Africa. Then there were men from occupied countries, Poland, France, Czechoslovakia, Norway, plus other volunteers. I think America, there was a man from Jamaica, Sri Lanka. So they came from all over the world to join Bomber Command to try and fight out the evil that was involving Europe at the time. Lincoln Cathedral goes back to something like 1090 originally, and this area, Lincolnshire, became known as Bomber County because there's so many airfields created as part of the strategic Bomber Command missions during the Second World War. We can see from the panels that individual family members have left their poppies in remembrance for their loved ones. In fact, there was 100 of the 126 squadrons, 32 were officially non-British, including 4 Polish squadrons. And our story today is about a crew from one of those squadrons. Flying in Bomber Command during the Second World War was such a dangerous occupation for so many reasons. Training flights killed so many men. Having survived that, you're about to take off in your bomber, and the most well known, although there were plenty of other types, is the Lancaster. You're shooting down the runway, full fuel load, 4,000 pound cookie and a sendries. The pilot's got his hands on the throttles wide open with the flight engineer backing him up to get every ounce of power out of the engine. And just as you're about to take off, you lose an engine. The resulting crash would most likely prove fatal for everybody on board. Then you had the enemy to contend with. Approach the enemy coast, you've got the very highly efficient German defence forces, the night fighters, the anti-aircraft or Flak defences to contend with, often radar predicted. The danger of other aircraft, because to combat some of these other threats, the bomber streams were tightened up to minimise the time over target, which increased the risk of collisions. Even having a bomb dropped on you from another aircraft, or occasionally even being shot at by another one of your comrades thinking you were the night fighter. All of these things happened. And then there was all the other dangers, still exist to this day. The weather. Probably when we sit in our pressurised airliners and the pilot puts on the seatbelt sign, you know, most of us are perhaps not that concerned. Some people are extremely worried about flying, but it's a bit of an inconvenience rather than a real worry. Even when the crew have to take their seats, we all really know that the aircraft is more than capable of dealing with any weather problems, and more importantly, the flight crew have the power to avoid it, or more likely climb above it. That wasn't the case for the bomber crews. They had to struggle through the bad weather and back again, particularly on the long runs to Berlin in the winters 43, 44. And our story factors the weather in it very much. It was the key contributing factor to the tragedy we'll be looking at again. It's impossible to know how many aircraft were lost because maybe one or more of the gunners were incapacitated by air sickness because of the violent storms they had to fly through, and the Ju-88 knife fighter sneaked in and shot them down. And even if you managed to bail out, of course the dangers didn't stop there. You're bailing out on a blacked out Europe into just blackness below you. You don't know where you're going to land. Could be on a building, could be in a river, could be on a railway line. And of course when you do land, do you injure yourself with a broken ankle or broken leg? Then there was the danger of being picked up, particularly if you bailed out near the target area, by enraged civilians who might put an end to you.
Keep their eyes peeled. They're firing at us now. Are they? Yeah. Coming close. Okay. Flak close. Well, it's coming close. I can feel it. Yes, I can see it.
Here in the Bomber Command Centre, they've established these peace gardens, and they've planted a local tree for the 27 Bomber Command stations, and we'll be looking at one of those trees, RAF Foldingworth. So we're looking at a map that outlines the stations that were created for the Strategic Bomber Command. Many are now, of course, disused and returned to farmland and other uses, which we will see. Centre's mission is remembrance, recognition and reconciliation. Towards the end of the war, Bomber Command was used for humanitarian purposes. And one of those was to help the Dutch citizens at the time who were starving, very short of food, and then Lancasters were sent in to drop them food. We're looking at an aerial view by the German Luftwaffe during the Second World War of Broughton, where the Vickers Armstrong Company were making Lancaster bombers. And our Lancaster PA 269 was manufactured there. Today that site is actually Airbus Industries, where they have the manufacturing of the Airbus, I believe the wings, and they have this special aircraft that flies them over to France. Of the 7,377 Lancasters built, only 2 remain flying. This is the one with the RAF Memorial Flight, which is PA 474, built at the same factory. And this is the picture of our Polish crew that feature in this tragedy. As we can see, there's 6 members here. A normal Lancaster crew on operations carried 7 members. It had 2 gunners, the pilot, of course, navigator, flight engineer, bomb aimer or air bomber as they call it in this story, and wireless operator. And this is a picture of 300 Squadron, the Polish squadron at Foldingworth, where they operated from. The pilot was Sulinskis, and he'd been in the Polish Air Force, and like the rest of the crew had made their way via France to England to continue the fight. Today, of course, RAF Foldingworth is long since ceased being an RAF field. It's now reverted to farmland and some commercial activities. But there is a memorial at the end of the old runway to the crews who lost their lives, including our crew of PA 269. A Lancaster Mark 1B. And of the 7,377 Lancasters built, 3,249 were lost in action. And of Bomber Command, a total of 8,325 aircraft were lost. But this story is not actually a war story. It's the 4th of February 1946, so the war is over, but 2 crews are scheduled for a training flight. It's a training flight in the main to train the air bomber in navigation. The pilot was substituted that day for the wing commander, who was actually not due to fly that day. Weather had been a concern and was mentioned during the briefings, and the training flight was to take off from here on the morning of the 4th of February 1946, fly to a nearby location of Scunthorpe and then on to the city of Leicester in the Midlands, and then the plan was to return to RAF Foldingworth. But fate took a different way for the crew of PA 269. A lot of these airfields today have a sort of haunting feel about them. Now they've reverted to civilian use, but obviously they've got so many memories. Perhaps best summarised by a poem. No Weeping Now by J.R. Walsh in 1976. I went back to the lonely wolds, the fens and the empty sky. I saw the tall, gaunt elms, heard the calling rooks. How time had passed me by. Grass had grown on the runways, in the hangars stood rusting ploughs. The dispersal points were empty, just starlings and grazing cows. The watch office stood deserted, or maybe the ghosts of men. Stood and watched as I walked, remembering, for I'll said, I'll come back again. The windsock hung in tatters, forlorn in the cold damp air. Then I thought, what does it matter? There is nobody here to care. The crew huts were but ruins, rotting timbers and sagging floors. Not a voice to break the silence, just the wind and the creaking doors. Then I recalled these once were billets, full of life and the noise of men, with the crackling roar of merlins, or the whispering scratch of a pen. So I stood quite still to listen. Was there a message there for me? In the shadows would they remember? Had they left me a sign to see? If he had, it was all too elusive, made dim by the veils of years. And I recalled all the purpose and courage, till my eyes were blurred by tears. I turned away downhearted, for this was not the field I had known, not the brave, bold home of my memories. Fool I was, for the years had flown. So we're looking at a reproduction of the pilot and flight engineer's notes for the Lancaster bomber, the various types that all crews would have been trained on. And part of the essential information was a piece of equipment called a pitot tube, which is on the wing of the plane, which then led the airspeed to the airspeed indicator and instrument in the panel in the cockpit. The problem is that under certain conditions that could potentially ice up, therefore giving incorrect information or no information perhaps to the pilot about their speed, their airspeed. But if you can see, looking at the diagrams, even in peacetime flying, all the information that was required by the pilot and of course the flight engineer. But also, of course, you had all the other crew positions. So it was a very complex piece of machinery, and I think in today's values, a Lancaster bomber would work out at sort of £2 million plus to build. So another view there of the pilot's seat, and he sat on his parachute. Lancasters are also notoriously difficult to actually bail out of in an emergency situation compared to some of the other bomber types. Correspondingly, percentage of actually pilots in period of war as prisoners of war was perhaps lower than other members of the crew. So that's the flight engineers panel, and a lot of that was linked to the fuel systems and balancing the fuel systems. So it's the 4th of February morning. The flight crews would have had their briefings and they take off on their training exercise to the city of Leicester. This is the small town of Wigston Magna in Leicestershire, in the centre of the UK. It's just south of the city of Leicester, and just down the road there on the left there's a building we'll come back to, which was a school at the time of our tragedy. Wigston Magna dates back to when the Angles and then the Danes came to England, so it's a old historic village. Now it's a small town. Population today is about 32,000. Following major housing developments after the Second World War in the 60s and the 70s, and continues today. And if you've never been here and you drove from the city of Leicester to Wigston, it's basically all mainly residential areas, but then south of Wigston you get into the Leicestershire countryside. We're looking at the 4th of February 1946. Of course, it was a totally different time. Although the war had finished, there were still plenty of reminders. Rationing, of course, was still in place. Many servicemen hadn't returned home, particularly a lot of the Leicestershire Regiment had been imprisoned as the Japanese. There were still German prisoners of war here working on the fields, and they also feature in our story. The weather was terrible that day. There was a terrible thunderstorm and a very low cloud base, estimated at probably only at about 300 feet. Sometime around estimated 1:15, 13:15, 13:20, an aircraft under power was heard in the cloud base. That's a modern school there that we'll look at. And it was seen by witnesses to come out of the cloud and clip the top of this building. This was at the time the Co-op building, no longer is. It was built around 1910, would have been a prominent building at the time. And this aircraft came out, and eyewitnesses state that it was on fire as it came out of the thunderstorm, although it had been hit by lightning. The official RAF aircraft report, which we'll look at, actually mentions other causes for the crash. But having come out of the cloud base, the captain, the wing commander Roman Sulinskis, would have quickly seen the town below him, and he banked sharply to avoid the town, and particularly to avoid a school. which we'll look at. At the time, the school was full of school children, about 80, and they'd been playing outside, and they were brought in because of the weather for, at the time, what used to be described as dinner. We'd probably say lunch today. That probably saved many lives as well, because when the crash happened, a lot of debris fell on the playground. But more importantly, the captain, Romund, narrowly missed the top of the school, and by doing so he certainly saved the lives of many children that day. Probably 80 plus lives he saved. Tragically, the whole crew of the Lancaster Bomber died. He tried to put it down on some playing fields, some of which still exists, which again we'll look at, but he wasn't able to make that, and the aircraft crashed. There is a plaque that's been placed by the local societies for passers-by to remember the bravery of this crew and their sacrifice, and this is on what's called Long Street in Wigston Magna, and it's very close to where the crash site actually happened. At the time we had the National Fire Service, and they were quickly on the scene, but all the crew will have died on impact. And we'll come back to this building. This is a new school built in the 1970s, which we'll return to. There's an approximate position of the crash site. This is the local paper, which is still going today, and they were quickly on the scene. And this was a house called the Beaches before the war, and at the time of the crash it crashed in front of this property, and as you can see there's parachutes draped over the roof there. I don't think the crew had any chance to bail out, that was just following the explosion. And today the beach house has long since gone, and there's a care home in that general facility. There were no casualties as such on the ground, although I think there were some minor injuries. Somebody was injured sitting on a bus, and there was, I think one of the school children had a minor injury, but there was many properties damaged in the locality, broken windows, etc, etc. But a very lucky escape for the people of Wigston. Now this is the school that the children were in at the time. It's now the records office. It was called the Modern School at the time. Apparently the aircraft passed less than 10 feet over the roof. So as the headmaster at the time said, the children had a very lucky escape. As I mentioned, a number of eyewitnesses actually stated the aircraft was on fire as it came out of the cloud burst, although it had been hit by lightning, and possibly it had. But this is the official RAF accident report and then the court of inquiry. Bit difficult to read, but you can always freeze the picture. They put the accident down to basically the bad weather, disorientation by the pilot due to possibly a pitot tube freeze up. The other aircraft on the same mission had had similar problems but overcome them, and it thought that the pilot had lost control in the cloud and came down under full power. And as I say then, he averted the school. So we're looking at a Commonwealth War Grave Commission site, which is part of the main cemetery in Newark-upon-Trent, which is in Nottinghamshire, England. This particular cemetery is very much dedicated to Polish forces, although not exclusively. And in this cemetery there's a memorial to Polish World War II forces, and it's also where I think it was General Sikorsky who became the Prime Minister of the Polish government in exile after the Germans invaded, was buried. He died in another air crash, which I think was under some sort of mysterious circumstances, but that's perhaps a story for another day, until his body was repatriated to Poland after the Second World War. But I do believe that a number of people come from Poland to visit this cemetery and their relatives. And as we'll see, there's plaques in both English and Polish. There's also a Polish bomber squadron trail that you can follow that can take you to various locations. There's a Heritage Centre project, and if you were visiting from obviously Poland or any other country and you wanted to base yourself in the locality, probably Lincoln would be the place to base yourself, because that's very close then to most of the major sites, or you could also base yourself in Newark. There is a sort of trail you can follow there with the different stations. As we say, they're all now probably closed, but there are some at RAF Ingham. I think they've created this Heritage Centre. I haven't been there myself yet. But something else you can do. Like all these cemeteries, it's immaculately kept. You know, all these Commonwealth War graves anywhere in the world, they are so well looked after, and quite rightly so. There is another memorial in the cemetery called the Airbridge Memorial, and that's in tribute to the 250 airmen of Britain, the Commonwealth and Poland, who gave their lives trying to supply the Polish resistance underground in the uprising in Warsaw. Again, that's a story for another day, and if you're not familiar with that, then where the Polish underground rose up against the Germans. They were hoping to get help from Stalin, which never happened, but the Allies tried to fly in supplies, essential supplies, to keep that going, but ultimately they weren't able to do that, and the Germans actually then defeated the Polish underground, and of course, as we probably know, destroyed a large part of Warsaw. So there's that memorial there to the air bridge. But of course we're here specifically to visit the graves of Lancaster Bomber crew PA 269. They flew together. Tragically, they died together, and they're buried here together in the Newark Cemetery. Rest in peace. But their sacrifice hasn't been forgotten today. These young people are part of the Royal Air Force Air Cadets, and this is 300 Squadron, Addison Squadron, and there is the link to the Polish 300 Squadron. So by their service today, they're honouring the service of the people that came before them. And it was good to meet them when I went over to see them on their drill night, and I thank them for their cooperation. The old school that the Lancaster Miss closed down, and then in the 1970s they built a new school. And in the grounds of where they were constructing the new school, they found some of the remains of the Lancaster. The main part, of course, had been removed at the time of the crash. One of the previous head teachers had created a very nice memorial to the crew. And I know that today the present head teacher, custodians of that memorial, and they are proud custodians. And they have a number of items in the school that tells the story. So it's very nice to see that the children who attend the school remember that crew, remember the story. I know over the years there's been a number of ceremonies with representatives from the Polish Embassy and the Polish Air Force, I believe, and the RAF and others. And I believe now that every year there is a service held on the anniversary, which of course is the 4th of February. So we can see some of the parts of the Lancaster that was found when they constructed the school and they dug the foundations.
Who will not know me, I was not born a man of war. My history has made me seeing door close after door. I flew for my homeland till my country was no more. Not in my name, but in my heart evermore. I took a tour around Europe, not the grand tour you understand. Living with the good, the bad, and worse, the underhand. Cross border after border, Hitler led a merry dance. Again I found my feet on land, and in the skies of France. But I still flew for Poland, though my country was no more. Not in my name, but in my heart evermore. For those who will not know me, you may still know how I came to England after France fell, a refugee again. But the RAF could use me, and anyone who'd fly, and we both spoke the language of the sky. But I still flew for Poland, though my country was no more. Not in my name, but in my heart evermore. From Wellington Wellingtons to Lancasters, from Faldingworth we flew. That small flat piece of Poland, like somewhere we well knew, though each day saw us fewer even than the few. I hope you think we played our part for you, but I still flew for Poland, though my country was no more. Not in my name, but in my heart evermore. For those who will not know me, perhaps you know my sons, who work the fields of Lincolnshire, plowshares instead of guns. I flew my plane for Poland, now you fly there for fun. So many years till peace was won, and once I flew for Poland, now my flying days are done. So many years till peace was won.